question to ask is, can we change mindset? Is there anything we can do about this in our students? So this relates to study 2. The answer is apparently so. So this is another paper, Implicit Theories of Intelligence Predict Achievement Across an Adolescent Transition, a longitudinal study and an intervention. Again, done in 2006. Now this paper had 2 studies within it. The first study was the first study took a really large group of students and tracked them. It was actually 4-year cohorts and tracked them all the way through their high school and measured their mindsets at the start and concluded that a growth mindset is associated with better performance, and that's better levels of improvement, we should say. The second study tests whether an intervention, that is teaching students that intelligence can be improved, makes any difference to their outcomes. And that's what we're going to look at now. So the experiment. It was completely voluntary. This was a smaller one. It was done over one grade 7 class, I believe. There were 91 students who volunteered to take part. After they went through a survey similar to the one you did at the start, it was concluded that, okay, I can't remember how many were fixed and how many were growth, but they were split into fixed and growth, and then those groups were combined into an experimental group and a control group, or a decoy duck group, as I've got here. There were 48 in the experimental group and 43 in the control group. Then the intervention went over 8 weeks, and it was 4 modules over 8 weeks, and each week they had a 25-minute period. So we're not actually talking about a large time investment here for the students. That's that in words. First module was the first 2 weeks, was on brain structure and function. So all the students, both in the control and the experimental group, were lumped together here, and they basically just learned about the brain. You know, it has different regions that control different functions, has a left and right hemisphere, it's connected to the body through the spinal cord, all these kind of basic things about the brain. Module 2, weeks 3 and 4, the group was split into experimental and control. Experimental group had their theory intervention, and they had to read aloud to each other an age-appropriate article called "You Can Grow Your Intelligence." And that included things like this picture. This picture is from that article. And this shows, it's a pretty bad photocopy, but it shows essentially the same species of animal. I'm not sure which animal it was. But on the left, we can see that animal that was kept in a cage for its whole life. And on the right, it's the same species of animal that was given toys and an ability to interact. And these are brain scans of the nerves and the neuronal connections in that brain. And we can see on the right there's much more complexity, many more bridges and nerves have been built. And so this was just telling the students, you know, more interaction, your brain grows, you get smarter, really quite clear stuff. It concluded with learning makes you smarter. And then the control group just looked at memory. They read a similar article, but it was about how we think memory works. And they were told tricks like you should chunk information when you're trying to learn it, tricks of how to remember grocery lists, mnemonic devices, and all those kinds of things. Module 3, weeks 5 and 6, was talked about stereotypes. So they were given pictures of individuals and they had to guess what those individuals' professions were. And then they were shown their correct professions. And then there was a discussion about how expectations can limit or enhance your expectations of abilities, or how stereotypes limit or enhance your expectations, which then could affect other things. And they talked about how stereotyping yourself and others can change your ambitions. And second half of the module was focused on study skills. So kind of a lot of the stuff that we could look at here, I guess: goal setting, time management, tips, strategies for studying, remembering, understanding, and organising materials. Fourth module, weeks 7 and 8, again they were split up. Experimental group recapped on what they'd learnt, inclusive of the incremental mindset kind of stuff. And then they thought about one thing that they had learned well from their whole life and discussed how they'd gone about it. And so they talked about the learning process, and a real emphasis was placed on how mistakes were made in that process and how those mistakes helped those students to learn that thing. And the session was concluded with everything you learn makes you smarter, and being smart is a choice. And the last session, session 8, part of module 4, talked about stereotyping again, and then concluded with everything is hard before it's easy, which I guess is true because we all start as babies. The control group just discussed how they were going with subjects, what they were finding difficult and hard in the first session, and then in session 8 they did a recap specifically of the memory task and talked about the cognitive abilities of different animals. What were the results? Well, the first thing they had to test was whether the intervention actually changed mindset. And they found that it had. So the mean score for mindset in the experimental group before was 4.36 out of, I think it was either a 6 or a 7-point score. And then afterwards it was 4.95. So there was a change there. And for the control group, there wasn't really. It went from 4.62 to 4.68. So that was good. That meant that the intervention had influenced mindset. Another thing was that the teachers who were teaching these students, so the experimenters ran all the workshops, and the teachers didn't actually know who was in the experimental group and who was in the control group. So that was kind of avoiding that Pygmalion in the classroom phenomenon, if you've heard about it, where teachers were told that some students were gifted, and then those students did better because the teachers gave them more attention. So it was really avoiding that kind of stuff. And throughout the intervention, these teachers reported that 17 of the students had increased motivation. And of those 17, 13 were in the experimental group and only 4 were in the control group. So that's a statistically significant result in terms of observations of motivation from the teachers. And then we can kind of graph the results. So there were 3 tests done. This was specifically for the maths students and the maths unit the intervention was about. One test in time period 1 was grade 6. So this was when the students were kind of coming into the program. Second was time 2, just before the intervention. And third was time 3, after the intervention. And so we can see how math scores kind of converged just before the intervention and then diverged after the intervention. And so this suggests that it did actually have, the intervention had an effect on the students' motivation and consequently their scores. An important thing to note here is this is only for students whose mindset was greater than 1 standard deviation outside of the mean for their group. So it's kind of like, it wasn't the borderline mindset students, it was the either fixed or growth. And if that isn't enough, 2 other interventions, one in 2002 concluded that students in the incremental theory training group subsequently earned higher grades. And then another one in 2003, incremental theory interventions led to significant improvements in adolescent achievement tests. So, conclusions. I thought I might put a little interesting story in here. So essentially, in the 1890 US Census, a new machine was brought in. It was invented by this bloke called Herman Hollerith, and it was a tabulating machine. And this was going to revolutionize the way that the census was done. It was really going to speed up the process. So Herman Hollerith got together a group of typists, and he was going to train them of how to use this machine. And he said, I think that a good typist should be able to punch 550 cards per day. So this is related to expectations and those motivations that we were talking about before. I expect that a good typist should be able to punch 550 cards per day. Two weeks later, they'd been trained really hard, been working hard, and the average score for those typists was about 550 cards per day, with the really good ones pushing at 700. Somewhere else in the country, though, they'd also incorporated this machine. It was the same training curriculum, but the only difference was Herman wasn't there and he hadn't told the group what he expected they were going to punch. 2 weeks later, the average for that group was 2,100 cards per day. The power of expectations. So what mindset was the group? So for those who did it by hand, here's the formula down the bottom. So yeah, the last thing was I just wanted to use the last 10 minutes or so to ask, do we address mindset in our program? Should we address mindset in our program? And how much time or how would we like to do that? So I guess I'll say thanks for listening, and if there's any questions, yeah, happy to answer them. Can I explain the scoring? Yeah, essentially each of the questions is characterizes either a fixed or a growth mindset thing. So if you give yourself if it characterizes a growth mindset and you give yourself a 7, then that counts that you're a strong mindsetter, and then you just average up the scores associated with each question.
And you just got 7 minus something.
High score is great.
No, so each of the questions will flip, and that's why one time we took the score, and the next question you take 7 minus the score, which flips the value of the score, and then yeah. No, but in the studies that I'd looked at, generally it was about 50-50 just of the students they reviewed. So I guess you could extrapolate from that, but I'm not sure. I guess it would be culturally specific as well. One of the main things that kind of comes out of this research is there will often be students that will cruise through, but then they'll get to a point, it might be in their undergrad or their postgrad or PhD or something, where they'll hit a wall. And that's when they really split. That's when you see, the fixed mindsetters will have an absolute breakdown, and the growth mindsetters will just go, okay, I really need to step this up. And often it's those high-achieving students who've always done really well. Maybe they were at a private school and they've done well, then they go to a university like ANU, where it's heaps of, or UTAS, where it's heaps of really high-quality competition, and suddenly they're not the top of the class. And that's when it really kind of, they really split. Yeah. And also something interesting I found with that intervention was, even though it was 8 weeks and 25 minutes per week, the part that was relevant to the fixed mindset was only really 2 half-hour periods, maybe 3 half-hour periods. So it's not a lot. It could just amount to us giving our students a document, or in the first tute just giving a quick information, or at the start of a lecture, something like that, and it could actually have quite large effects.